What if the fantasy stories you love were born from ancient Viking myths? Imagine sitting beside a fire 1,000 years ago. The cold northern wind is howling outside a wooden hall. A storyteller begins speaking of gods, monsters, and destiny. Those stories were not just entertainment, they were the heartbeat of an entire civilization. These were the legends of Norse mythology. And surprisingly, those ancient legends still shape fantasy stories today. Every time you read about powerful gods or magical worlds, echoes appear. Those echoes often come directly from Norse myths. But how did stories from Viking warriors influence modern fantasy literature? Why do these ancient tales still feel so powerful today? The answer lies in the deep imagination of the Norse people. Norse mythology was filled with dramatic worlds and epic struggles. Their stories described a universe held together by a giant tree. This cosmic tree was called Yggdrasil. Its branches connected multiple realms of existence. Gods lived in one realm called Asgard. Humans lived in another realm called Midgard. Meanwhile, dark and mysterious creatures existed in other worlds. This idea of multiple worlds fascinated later fantasy writers because it created endless possibilities for storytelling. One of the most powerful themes in Norse mythology was destiny. Even the gods themselves could not escape fate. The Norse believed that the end of the world was inevitable. That catastrophic event was called Ragnarok. During Ragnarok, gods and monsters would clash in a final battle. This dramatic concept inspired many fantasy authors centuries later. Writers realized these myths contained incredible storytelling power. They were filled with heroism, sacrifice, and tragic endings. Unlike many other mythologies, Norse stories were brutally honest. Victory was never guaranteed. Even the strongest heroes could fall. That sense of danger made the stories unforgettable. One of the most famous Norse gods was Odin. Odin was not just a ruler of gods, he was a seeker of wisdom and knowledge. In one legend, Odin sacrificed his own eye. He did this to gain greater understanding of the universe. That powerful theme of sacrifice appears frequently in fantasy literature today. Another famous Norse god was Thor. Thor wielded a mighty hammer called Mjolnir. This magical weapon could destroy giants and protect the gods. The idea of enchanted weapons later became a major fantasy trope. But Norse mythology was not only about gods. It also introduced terrifying creatures and magical beings. There were frost giants, dragons, and shape-shifting tricksters. One of the most mysterious figures was Loki. Loki was clever, unpredictable, and often dangerous. Characters like Loki inspired many complex villains in fantasy stories. These myths created a perfect foundation for epic storytelling. They combined mystery, magic, and moral struggles. Over time, these stories traveled far beyond Scandinavia, and eventually, they began shaping the fantasy worlds we know today. But the true explosion of Norse influence was only just beginning. As centuries passed, Norse myths slowly traveled across Europe. Scholars translated these ancient Viking stories into modern languages. Suddenly, writers discovered a treasure of powerful ideas. Among those writers was a quiet professor named J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was fascinated by ancient mythologies and languages, but Norse mythology captured his imagination like nothing else. He saw in those myths a deep sense of epic storytelling, so he began weaving those elements into his own fictional world. That world eventually became Middle-earth, and Middle-earth would change fantasy literature forever. Many readers do not realize how deeply Norse mythology shaped Tolkien's work. For example, the very idea of dwarves comes from Norse myths. In Norse legends, dwarves were skilled craftsmen and miners. They lived underground and forged magical weapons. Tolkien adopted this concept almost directly. His dwarves were also master builders and weapon makers. Even the names of some dwarves came from Norse poems. These names appeared in an ancient text called the Poetic Edda. Tolkien borrowed several of them for his stories. Another major influence was the character of Gandalf. Gandalf resembles the Norse god Odin in many ways. Odin often traveled disguised as an old wandering man. He carried wisdom, mystery, and magical knowledge. Gandalf reflects that same mysterious archetype. Even Gandalf's appearance mirrors Odin's legendary look. Both figures are often described with long beards and staffs. But Norse influence did not stop there. The concept of powerful magical rings also echoes Norse myths. In Norse legends, cursed rings brought greed and destruction. These rings corrupted those who possessed them. Tolkien transformed this idea into the One Ring. The One Ring became one of the most iconic objects in fantasy. Dragons in fantasy stories also have Norse origins. One famous Norse dragon was called Fafnir. Fafnir guarded a cursed treasure hoard. He was consumed by greed and isolation. Tolkien's dragon Smaug shows strong similarities to this myth. Both dragons guard treasure and symbolize dangerous greed. The theme of heroic battles against monsters also appears repeatedly. Norse heroes often fought giants, serpents, and dark creatures. Fantasy literature later adopted this heroic tradition. Brave warriors confronting impossible dangers became a common fantasy theme. Another Norse influence was the concept of world-ending battles. Remember Ragnarok from the earlier myths. That final battle inspired many fantasy apocalyptic events. In modern fantasy, massive final wars are very common. Entire worlds often stand on the edge of destruction. Heroes must rise to prevent catastrophe. This storytelling structure came directly from Norse traditions. Writers realized that these myths carried emotional power. They combined tragedy, courage, and destiny into unforgettable narratives. Because of this, Norse mythology became a foundation for fantasy storytelling. New writers continued building on those ancient ideas, and fantasy literature slowly evolved into the genre we know today. But the influence of Norse mythology goes far deeper than most people realize. Now, here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Norse mythology did not just inspire a few fantasy ideas. It quietly became the blueprint for the entire genre. Many fantasy worlds follow structures that mirror Norse cosmology. Think about the concept of multiple realms or dimensions. This idea appears constantly in modern fantasy stories. But that structure existed long before fantasy novels. Norse mythology already described 9 interconnected worlds. These worlds were all connected by the cosmic tree, Yggdrasil. This concept introduced a universe with layered realities. Modern fantasy often uses the same design. Different magical realms exist alongside the human world. Portals allow travel between these worlds. Powerful beings rule over each realm. This structure can be seen in many famous fantasy franchises. Even the Marvel Universe borrowed heavily from Norse mythology. Characters like Thor and Loki come directly from these myths. Asgard appears as a powerful realm of Gults. The Bifrost Bridge connects different worlds. This is almost identical to the mythological descriptions. But the influence goes beyond movies and comics. It appears in darker fantasy stories as well. Consider the brutal world of Game of Thrones. Its harsh environment and tragic heroes echo Norse storytelling. In Norse myths, heroes often fight knowing they will lose. Their courage comes from facing fate anyway. That same tragic heroism appears in modern fantasy narratives. The idea that destiny cannot be avoided feels deeply Norse. Another hidden influence is the concept of morally complex characters. Norse mythology rarely divides characters into simple good or evil. Even gods can be flawed, selfish, or destructive. Loki is the perfect example of this complexity. Sometimes he helps the gods, sometimes he betrays them. This unpredictable morality inspired modern fantasy villains. Today's fantasy characters are rarely purely heroic. They struggle with inner conflict and difficult choices. This storytelling style adds realism and depth. Another Norse idea shaping fantasy is the importance of prophecy. In Norse myths, prophecies often drive the entire narrative. Characters act because they believe destiny is approaching, but their attempts to avoid fate often cause it instead. This tragic irony appears frequently in fantasy literature. It creates tension that keeps readers hooked. Even the atmosphere of many fantasy worlds reflects Norse influence. Dark forests, frozen landscapes, and ancient ruins feel distinctly Nordic. These environments create a mood of mystery and danger. Fantasy authors use these settings to evoke epic adventure. Over time, readers began associating these elements with fantasy itself. Yet most people never realize where these ideas truly came from. The ancient Vikings unknowingly shaped modern storytelling. Their myths planted seeds that grew into entire fantasy worlds. Writers across generations continued expanding those seeds, and the influence of Norse mythology kept spreading silently. But perhaps the most powerful impact of these myths is still ahead. So why do Norse myths continue influencing fantasy after so many centuries? The answer lies in the emotional depth of these ancient stories. Norse mythology was never just about gods and monsters. It was about survival in a harsh and unpredictable world. The Vikings lived in a land of brutal winters and violent seas. Life was uncertain and often short. Their myths reflected this reality in powerful ways. Heroes were brave, but they were never invincible. Even gods could suffer loss and defeat. This tragic realism made Norse stories deeply human. Modern fantasy writers recognize the strength of that approach. Perfect heroes rarely feel believable to readers, but flawed heroes struggling against fate feel real. That is exactly what Norse mythology provides. It offers characters who fight even when hope seems impossible. This theme resonates strongly with modern audiences. People connect with stories about resilience and courage. Fantasy literature uses these themes to inspire readers. Another reason for Norse mythology's influence is its rich symbolism. Many Norse symbols represent universal human struggles. The great tree Yggdrasil symbolizes the interconnectedness of all life. Ragnarok represents the cycle of destruction and renewal. Even the gods must accept the passage of time. These symbolic ideas make the stories timeless. Fantasy writers often borrow these symbols to add deeper meaning. Readers may not always notice these references consciously, but they still feel the emotional power behind them. Norse mythology also introduced unforgettable legendary creatures. Dragons, giants, and mythical beasts filled the Viking imagination. These creatures later became staples of fantasy storytelling. Without Norse mythology, many fantasy worlds would feel incomplete. The dramatic scale of Norse myths also influenced storytelling style. Everything in these myths felt larger than life. Battles were massive, and consequences were enormous. Fantasy writers embraced this epic scale. Entire kingdoms now rise and fall in fantasy narratives. Heroes often carry the fate of the world on their shoulders. This sense of grandeur captivates readers everywhere. But perhaps the greatest influence is the theme of courage. Norse heroes knew the future might be tragic, yet they still chose to stand and fight. That message is powerful even today. It reminds us that bravery does not require guaranteed victory. Sometimes, courage means facing impossible odds. Fantasy literature carries that message forward to new generations. Every epic quest echoes the spirit of Norse legends. Every heroic sacrifice reflects ancient Viking values. Readers continue returning to these themes again and again because they speak to something deeply human. The struggle against darkness is a universal story, and Norse mythology captured that struggle perfectly. That is why these myths refuse to fade away. They continue inspiring writers and readers around the world, and their legacy lives on in every great fantasy adventure. But the final lesson hidden inside these myths may surprise you. So what is the final lesson hidden inside Norse mythology? The answer is surprisingly simple, yet incredibly powerful. Stories survive when they reflect the deepest truths of humanity. Norse mythology did exactly that. It captured courage, struggle, sacrifice, and destiny. Those themes are universal and timeless. That is why these ancient myths never truly disappeared. Instead, they quietly evolved into new forms. Fantasy literature became their modern stage. Writers across the world began reimagining these legendary ideas. They created new worlds inspired by ancient Viking imagination. Yet the spirit of the original myths remained alive. Every magical realm echoes the branches of Yggdrasil. Every heroic warrior reflects the bravery of Norse legends. Even modern audiences still respond to these ancient ideas. When readers see a hero facing impossible odds, something awakens inside them. It reminds them of humanity's oldest stories. Stories where courage mattered more than victory. Stories where destiny could not be avoided. But heroes still chose to stand tall. That message resonates deeply in our modern world. Life itself often feels unpredictable and uncertain. People face struggles that seem overwhelming, yet stories inspired by Norse mythology offer hope. They remind us that bravery defines a hero, not the outcome of the battle. This philosophy continues inspiring readers and storytellers everywhere, and that influence shows no signs of fading. New fantasy books appear every year. Many of them unknowingly borrow ideas from Norse legends. Epic quests, magical weapons, and powerful destinies remain central themes. Even the structure of modern fantasy worlds mirrors ancient myths. Multiple realms, ancient prophecies, and cosmic battles appear again and again. These elements create the magic that fantasy fans love. And behind that magic stands the legacy of Norse mythology, a legacy shaped by warriors, poets, and storytellers centuries ago. They never imagined their stories would travel across the world. Yet their imagination helped shape an entire literary genre. Fantasy literature owes much of its foundation to those ancient tales, and the influence continues growing with each new generation of writers. Perhaps that is the true power of mythology. It connects past, present, and future through storytelling. Norse myths remind us that stories are never truly lost. They simply transform and reappear in new forms. Every time someone opens a fantasy book, that legacy continues. Every epic adventure carries echoes of ancient Viking legends, and every reader becomes part of that storytelling tradition. So the next time you enter a fantasy world, pause for a moment. Listen carefully to the echoes hidden within the story. You might hear whispers of Odin, Thor, and Loki. You might feel the shadow of Ragnarok approaching. Those echoes come from the ancient myths of the North, and they will continue inspiring imagination for centuries to come. Because great stories never truly end. They simply wait for the next storyteller to bring them back to life.